In the quiet, picturesque village of Dunford, where every face seems familiar and every smile trustworthy, a scheme has unfolded, one that is far more than just a simple theft. As the town prepared for the bake-off, someone played a silent move, not just to win, but to unravel secrets buried deep beneath the surface. Who in this charming village craves not victory, but someone else's downfall? And why does a face that appears innocent in daylight seem to shift under the cover of dusk? This is not just a story about a competition, not just about a stolen recipe, not just about a town's whispers. This is a mystery that twists tighter the more you try to unravel it. Midnight had crept upon the old Lantern Inn, yet its presence was anything but silent. A sharp autumn wind howled against the high-arched windows, rattling the aged glass panes like a whispering omen. The scent of damp leaves and distant wood smoke curled through the cracks, threading its way into the snug common room where the Friday night club, 6 individuals bound by wit and an insatiable curiosity, had gathered in their customary seats around a polished oak table. The glow of gas lamps flickered against dark-paneled walls, casting elongated shadows that seemed to breathe with unseen life. Conversation had flowed easily that evening, punctuated by the soft clink of silver spoons against delicate china, the warmth of the crackling hearth wrapping around them like an old familiar embrace. But beneath the comfort lay something else, a shift in the air, an unease that no one had yet named. At the heart of it all sat Agatha Marple, her presence as unassuming as ever, yet holding a quiet command over the room. Short in stature, her gentle features were marked by lines of wisdom rather than age, her steel-grey eyes ever watchful behind a modest pair of spectacles. Clad in a simple tweed jacket, she lifted her teacup with the grace of someone who saw more than she spoke, who listened not just to words but to the silences between them. And tonight, those silences seemed heavier than usual. The quiet was shattered by the sudden bang of the entrance door bursting open, sending a gust of cold air snaking through the room. Margaret Carter, the proprietress of the inn, stood framed in the doorway, breathless, disheveled, her dark blue frock creased with agitation. Her usually composed face was drained of color, her fingers trembling where they clutched the doorframe. The lively murmur of the club stilled at once, the warmth of the moment now replaced with an undercurrent of dread. Agatha lowered her cup. "My dear, whatever has happened?" Margaret took a shaky step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's gone," she choked out. "My recipe book. Stolen." A stunned silence followed. Then, like the first drops of rain before a storm, murmurs rippled through the group. Not just any book. It was Margaret's prized collection of recipes, a guarded compendium of secrets that had made her an unchallenged culinary legend. Its pages held formulas so coveted that even whispers of its contents had traveled beyond Dunford. With the Harvest Festival bake-off just days away, a contest carrying not just prestige but a sizable cash prize, this theft was no mere act of mischief. It was a deliberate strike. Lucy Spencer, the young journalist with a mind as sharp as her hazel eyes, sat forward. "Are you certain it hasn't been misplaced?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Margaret's voice trembled, but her certainty did not waver. "I know exactly where I keep it. The storeroom, cabinet locked." Her breath hitched. "But I found the door broken open." Her hand, still unsteady, fumbled in her apron pocket before pulling out a small crumpled slip of paper. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of unease through the group. Agatha took it with a nod of thanks, smoothing the note between her fingers. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, almost aggressive. The ink bled slightly into the paper's fine, as though the writer had pressed down too hard, too hastily. Just 5 ominous words glared back at her. "You won't be winning this time." The words hung in the air like a curse. Dr. Brooks, the genial physician with a penchant for long-winded anecdotes, exhaled slowly. "This isn't just theft," he murmured. "It's a warning." Margaret swallowed hard, gripping the edge of a nearby chair to steady herself. "I haven't touched anything else in the storeroom. As soon as I saw the mess, I came straight here." A draught whistled through the room, making the gas lamps flicker, as if the very walls had leaned in to listen. Martin Lowe, the reserved ex-military man whose past was spoken of only in hushed tones, rubbed his chin. "Surely no one would go to such lengths over a bake-off," he muttered. But even he didn't sound convinced. "They would," Dr. Brooks countered, his expression darkening. "Margaret's recipes are legendary. That prize money is a fortune for some." And with the right recipe in hand, he trailed off, leaving the implication to settle. Margaret's fingers clenched around her apron. "I just don't understand," she whispered. "Who would do this?" The answer lingered unspoken between them. Outside, the wind screeched against the windows, pressing against the glass like unseen hands, desperate to be heard. And in that moment, as the shadows stretched a little longer, and the silence settled a little heavier, Agatha Marple knew one thing for certain. The real mystery had only just begun. The heavy stillness of the old Lantern Inn was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, its hands inching toward midnight like a silent witness to the unease thickening in the air. The Friday night club, 5 keen minds accustomed to the art of deduction, stood gathered in the dimly lit corridor, their breath mingling with the faint scent of aged wood and the lingering traces of baked apples from the evening's supper. At the front, Agatha Marple, ever composed, held the half-crumpled note in her gloved fingers, her sharp eyes tracing each jagged letter with an intensity that suggested she was reading more than words. She was deciphering intent. The torn edges, the pressure of the ink, the subtle slant of each letter, they all whispered clues only she could hear. Beyond the narrow hallway, shadows stretched long and uncertain, the single flickering wall lamp barely keeping them at bay. Margaret Carter, the innkeeper, stood beside her, hands wringing the fabric of her apron, her knuckles stark white against the dark blue cloth. Fear shone in her eyes, fear not just of the theft, but of what it meant. The storeroom held more than just supplies, it was the lifeblood of her establishment, the sanctuary of recipes that had built her name. And now, it was violated. "Come," she whispered, voice unsteady, "you should see for yourselves." The club followed, their footsteps echoing against the polished wooden floorboards, the sound swallowed by the heavy stillness pressing in around them. Dr. Brooks, the town's physician, cast a steadying glance at Margaret, his presence a pillar of reassurance. Beside him, Lucy Spencer, the young journalist, moved with silent precision, her keen mind already spinning theories, while Martin Lowe, the ex-military man, adjusted the strap of his watch, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, as if expecting something, or someone to emerge. As they reached the storeroom, the scent of flour and dried herbs clung to the air, an almost deceptive normalcy. Then, the sight before them stopped them cold. The door, once sturdy, now hung ajar, its lock splintered like brittle bone, jagged wood edges betraying the violence of forced entry. The room beyond was eerily undisturbed, save for a single overturned jar of salt, its contents spilled across the floorboards like a crude, accidental omen. But the true absence, the one that made Margaret Carter's breath hitch in her throat, was the small empty space on the second shelf, the place where her leather-bound recipe book should have been. Gone, vanished, stolen. A silence settled, thick and expectant, each club member absorbing the scene with different eyes, some searching for logical explanations, others sensing the underlying malice in what had transpired. Not just a theft, a statement. And then Agatha Marple moved, stepping forward with the precision of a woman accustomed to unveiling truths buried beneath the ordinary. Her gaze swept the room, the slightly shifted flour sack in the corner, the scuff mark near the door, the faint indentation in the dust where something, or someone, had lingered too long. A soft rustle of fabric, an exhaled breath, a mind already assembling the puzzle pieces no one else yet saw. From the doorway, Lucy broke the silence. Whoever did this, she murmured, knew exactly what they were after. Martin exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if bracing for the hunt. and they weren't afraid to take it. Margaret swallowed, voice barely a whisper. But why? A question that hung unanswered in the charged air. Because this wasn't just about a stolen book, it was about power, leverage, control. And as the wind outside pressed against the window panes with an eerie, restless moan, Agatha Marple tucked the note into her jacket and turned, her mind already 3 steps ahead, unraveling the first thread of a mystery that would shake the very foundations of Dunford. For the old Lantern Inn had harbored many secrets over the years, but tonight one of them had come to light, and whatever had begun in the shadows was far from over. The fire crackled in the grand hearth of the old Lantern Inn, its warmth casting shifting shadows across the walnut-paneled walls. The Friday night club, 5 discerning minds drawn together by curiosity and intellect, gathered as they did every week, their discussions drifting between idle conversation and deeper musings on the mysteries of human nature. Agatha Marple, composed as ever in her tweed jacket and neat silver hair, sipped her tea in quiet contemplation, her sharp grey eyes missing nothing. Across the table, Lucy Spencer, the ever-keen journalist, leaned forward, poised to counter a point made by Dr. Edwin Brooks, the affable yet perceptive physician, when the door to the lounge burst open. Margaret Carter, the usually unshakable proprietor of the Old Lantern, stood in the doorway, her breath ragged, her face ashen. "It's gone," she choked, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "My recipe book. Someone has stolen it." A hush fell over the room, the cozy atmosphere shattered in an instant. Lucy's teacup rattled in its saucer as she straightened, eyes flashing with alarm. "Stolen?" she echoed, incredulous. "Are you sure?" Margaret's fingers twisted in her apron, her distress palpable. "The cupboard was forced open, my notes are in disarray, and my special ingredients ruined, deliberately." Her voice wavered as she struggled to steady herself. "The Dunford Harvest Festival is only days away, and without that book," she broke off, her hands clenching, her panic barely contained. Dr. Brooks set his cup aside, and rose, his usually jovial face now creased with concern. "Margaret," he said gently, "take a breath. Start from the beginning. What exactly did you find?" Margaret inhaled shakily. "I went to the storeroom to retrieve my book. Every year I use my best recipes for the festival, but the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong." She glanced toward the open doorway, where the corridor beyond seemed to darken with the weight of what lay ahead. "The lock on my spice cabinet was broken. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, but then," she swallowed hard, "I saw the mess. My notes scattered, my handwritten recipes gone, and the special ingredients I had set aside for the festival, covered in salt, spilled everywhere." A heavy silence settled over the group, broken only by the fire's occasional pop. From his usual chair, Martin Lowe, the quiet, watchful ex-intelligence officer, exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering with interest. "The bake-off brings recognition," he mused. "And the winner's charity gets a significant donation. Could that be a motive?" Margaret's already pale face lost what little color remained. "I've won many times before," she admitted. "And this year," she hesitated, then continued, voice hushed. "This year I had a personal reason for wanting to win." Lucy's journalist instincts flared. "What kind of personal reason?" Margaret hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line before she shook her head. "Whoever took that book knew exactly what they were doing." A faint tension gripped the room, as if unseen eyes were watching. The theft wasn't just about a competition, it was personal. Dr. Brooks glanced toward Agatha Marple, who had been listening in quiet intensity. He gave a knowing nod. "Shall we take a look?" Margaret hesitated only a moment before nodding, her movements tight with anxiety. "Please, I don't know what to do." Agatha Marple set her teacup down with quiet finality and rose, the firelight catching in her perceptive gaze. Though her demeanor remained unhurried, there was an unshakable sense of purpose in her movements. "Show us, my dear," she said, her voice steady, reassuring. "We will find out the truth." Together they stepped into the corridor, where the warm glow of the lounge faded behind them, swallowed by the growing shadows ahead. The transition from the warmly lit common room to the shadowed corridor was stark, the golden sconces along the walls long since dulled by time, their glow struggling against the encroaching gloom. The passage seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if burdened by secrets it had absorbed over decades. At the far end, the storeroom door hung ajar, the lock splintered and warped around the brass latch, bearing silent testimony to an intrusion executed with unsettling intent. As Agatha Marple stepped forward, a faint draught carried the scent of overturned spices and something subtler, something heavier, the unmistakable air of quiet violation. The soft crunch beneath her feet drew her gaze downward, a spill of salt, glistening in the dim light, a peculiar, almost ritualistic ruin. Along the shelves jars of cinnamon, nutmeg and cardamom sat askew, their contents disturbed as if by frantic, greedy hands. But it was the farthest shelf, the one where Margaret's most prized ingredients were kept, that bore the true evidence of deliberate, methodical sabotage. Lucy Spencer inhaled sharply, stepping into the room with measured caution. "This wasn't just a theft," she murmured, surveying the scene. "Someone wanted destruction." Margaret Carter, wringing her hands against her apron, exhaled a breath that barely held form. "They took my brandy. The best one, and my sugar too." Her voice wavered. "But my notes, my spicing ratios, I can't find them. If they're gone." She trailed off, her expression crumpling. Agatha placed a steadying hand on Margaret's forearm, her grip light yet firm. "Courage, my dear," she said, her voice as smooth and unshaken as ever. "The world may be filled with unscrupulous sorts, but they always leave their mark, like footprints in fresh snow." A low hum of thought came from behind them. Dr. Edwin Brooks, ever the quiet observer, stroked his chin as he surveyed the scene. Martin Lowe, standing by the doorway with arms crossed, had the rigid stillness of a man trained to watch and wait. No one spoke. Each in their own way was already unraveling the implications. With the patience of one assembling a puzzle, Agatha knelt by the broken lock, her fingers tracing the rough, jagged edges. She examined the floor, her gaze shifting over the overlapping footprints in the salt, some smudged, some clean as though someone had paced here more than once. A slight tilt of her head suggested a mind already forming patterns from chaos. At last she straightened, dusting her hands. "It may seem a petty act of vandalism," she said, her tone deceptively light, "but I have yet to meet a thief without purpose. This wasn't random." Her eyes flicked to Margaret. "Someone didn't just want to sabotage you. They wanted to ensure something would be lost forever." Margaret, already pale, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of that realization. The storeroom itself seemed to press inward, the walls absorbing their unspoken suspicions. Outside, dusk deepened, and with it, a creeping sense of unease, as though the old inn itself had begun to listen. Without warning, the wind moaned through the eaves, rattling the shutters like an unseen hand testing the strength of locked doors. A single candle guttered in its holder, its flame shrinking before finding itself again. The quiet that followed was thick, heavy, like a pause before something inevitable. Margaret raised a trembling hand to her temple. "What must I do?" she whispered. Agatha Marple's expression softened, though her eyes held the glint of a hunter scenting the first traces of its prey. "We shall uncover the truth," she said, with the certainty of someone who had done so many times before. "One must simply know where to look." And somewhere within the dim confines of the storeroom, beneath the scent of disturbed spices and the hush of old walls holding their breath, the answer already lurked, waiting to be found. Dr. Edwin Brooks murmured, his voice laced with both curiosity and unease. "Look at this." Agatha Marple stepped forward, Lucy Spencer and Martin Lowe close behind, their collective gaze falling on the small scrap of parchment, Brooks held between careful fingers. A single crudely scrawled sentence ran across it in jagged ink. "I'll make sure you don't win." A shallow breath passed between them, settling most heavily upon Margaret Carter, whose hands clenched the edges of her apron as though bracing against an invisible force. Lucy's hazel eyes flashed in the dim light. "So it isn't just the recipe book," she murmured, voice low and tight. "Someone wants to ruin Margaret's chances entirely." The words sat like a weight in the still air, their implications darker than mere theft. Margaret's breath shuddered as she glanced at the message. "This feels personal." Her voice wavered. "Who would wish me such ill will?" Disbelief and unease warred on her face, her confidence fraying with every passing second. Agatha stepped forward, her keen gaze flicking briefly from the tattered parchment to the wreckage around them, the spilled salt, the broken jars, the careful ruin left in the saboteur's wake. The silver glint of her neatly pinned hair caught in the low lamplight, but her expression remained composed, thoughtful, her voice even as ever. "If this were simple theft," she observed, "the culprit might have taken what they needed and fled. But this speaks of something else. The destruction, the mess, the deliberate placement of that note, it suggests intent beyond mere mischief." Dr. Brooks gave a slow nod. Whoever did this wanted more than to steal. They wanted to destroy, to send a message. Lucy glanced around as if expecting a figure to emerge from the storeroom's deepening shadows. "A competitor," she exhaled sharply. "The bake-off does attract its fair share of passionate contenders." Martin, ever the quiet sentry, let out a contemplative hum, arms still folded. "Passion, jealousy. Those are powerful forces, especially when ambition and reputation are at stake." His words lingered, an echo of knowledge learned in darker places. Margaret, struggling to keep her composure, lifted her chin with an effort. "I've been part of that festival for years. Never, not once has anyone resorted to this." Her voice faltered, a note of doubt slipping through. "No one has resented me enough to sabotage my work." Yet even as she said it, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Agatha met her gaze with quiet reassurance, her gloved hand resting lightly on Margaret's arm. "Fear and ambition can twist even the most ordinary of people," she said, her voice a careful balance of understanding and warning. Then with a slight tilt of her head, a wry glimmer of dryness entered her tone. "Besides, Dunford is hardly the sleepy little village it pretends to be, not when the stakes grow high." A silence followed, thick and weighty, as if each of them, Lucy, Martin, Brooks, were momentarily recalling past grudges, old wounds, the unseen tensions that lurked beneath the town's polite veneer. The wooden walls, once the proud bones of a noble hunting estate, seemed to lean inward, as though they too remembered the secrets they had been forced to keep. At last Dr. Brooks cleared his throat. "What do you suggest we do, Miss Marple?" Agatha's gaze flickered from the note to the spilled salt, then to the broken lock on the storeroom's cabinet, the pieces of an unseen puzzle clicking into place in her mind. "I suggest," she said calmly, "that we proceed carefully. Let us gather facts, not assumptions. Rushing to conclusions can be just as reckless as a thief in the night." Margaret inhaled deeply, steeling herself as she turned toward the door. "I'll see to cleaning this up," she murmured, though her voice carried little conviction. In the meantime, a flicker of determination passed over her features, though it did not quite reach her eyes. As they stepped out of the storeroom, the note still clutched in Agatha's fingers, a late autumn draught slithered through the corridor, slipping between the aged timbers of the inn, whispering of something unseen yet looming, waiting. It was a chill that spoke of more than the season's change, a silent warning, a hint of menace curling at the edges of the night. And as each member of the Friday night club withdrew into their own thoughts, one thing was certain: secrets never stayed buried for long. As each member of the Friday night club withdrew into their own thoughts, the riddle of the missing recipe book took on a far more sinister shape. It was no longer a simple matter of petty theft. It was a puzzle steeped in deliberate malice, an unseen hand maneuvering in the dark. Outside, twilight faded, surrendering to moonlit shadows that stretched like silent sentinels across the cobbled village paths. The old Lantern Inn, its once grand timbers weathered by time, stood brooding against the encroaching night. Within its dim-lit interior, Agatha Marple sat in measured contemplation, the cryptic note still clutched in her gloved fingers. This was no ordinary sabotage. She could feel it in the very bones of Dunford, a village where secrets simmered beneath the surface, veiled by polite smiles and the rhythmic clatter of teacups. By dawn, a pale, reluctant sun struggled against the dense autumn fog that clung to Dunford's narrow lanes, wrapping itself around stone walls and timbered eaves like an unseen predator. The ancient church steeple rose like a lone guardian above the swirling mist, its silent watch seeming almost foreboding. Within the old Lantern Inn, where time had once echoed with the voices of noblemen and scandalous whispers, lamps still glowed behind leaded windows. Silhouettes stirred within, early risers preparing for the day, but among them one group sat apart, drawn together not by routine but by a mystery that refused to be ignored. In the snug warmth of the inn's parlor, where the faint scent of wood smoke and spiced scones lingered, the Friday night club gathered, a seemingly unremarkable group, yet one bound by a sharpness of mind few in Dunford suspected. Their mild exteriors masked keen intellects, watchful eyes, and an unshakable curiosity. At the heart of them all sat Agatha Marple, a woman of quiet authority. Silver-haired, her features etched with the grace of experience, she presided over the gathering like a librarian meticulously organizing the pieces of an unsolved enigma. She was no detective in title, but in nature, she was nothing less. The amber glow of the parlor fire cast a warm sheen over her thoughtful expression, the fine lines of her face telling of years spent observing, listening, and most importantly, understanding. The stolen recipe book. The malicious warning, "I'll make sure you don't win." The words remained lodged in her mind, unsettling in their simplicity, as if hinting at a grudge long festering beneath the surface. Jealousy was an insidious thing. It did not strike like a thunderclap. It seeped, twisted, burrowed into the most unexpected of hearts. A faint clink of porcelain broke her reverie. Across from her, perched in a sturdy wooden chair, Dr. Edwin Brooks stirred his tea with a deliberate slowness. A genial man with a broad smile and a voice rich with both warmth and theatricality, he had earned the village's trust as their doctor. But beneath his easygoing demeanor lay an astute mind, one finely attuned to the undercurrents of human nature. He exhaled a small chuckle, his gaze bright with amusement as he recounted a recent patient who had mistaken a simple cold for a deadly illness. "You wouldn't believe it," he said. "The poor fellow all but wrote his own obituary over a bit of sneezing." Agatha's lips quirked in a knowing smile. "One must be grateful you were there to prevent an unnecessary funeral." Brooks let out a hearty chuckle. "Well, one does try." Then, leaning forward, his tone dropped into one of quiet intrigue. "But tell me, Miss Marple, what do you make of our little mystery?" For a moment, Agatha simply studied the steam rising from her cup. Then, with the same measured calm that had long unnerved those who underestimated her, she set her cup down and met his gaze. "I think," she said, her voice soft but edged with certainty, "that someone in this village is hiding far more than a stolen recipe book." A hush settled over the room. Beyond the inn's walls the mist thickened, the distant church bell chiming the hour, a sound that carried not just through the damp morning air, but through the very marrow of those who listened. Dunford was waking, but so too was the danger lurking within it. "No harm done, merely keeps the conversation lively," Dr. Edwin Brooks said, flashing a disarming smile, one Agatha Marple had seen often enough to recognize as a mask for exaggeration. Yet beneath his jovial manner lay a keen observer, a man whose profession demanded he notice the smallest tremors in a pulse, the barely perceptible hesitation in a voice. His patients might confide their ailments to him, but Agatha suspected they unknowingly revealed far more than mere symptoms. She had watched him, time and again pieced together truths that no one had intended to share. Beside the tall, mist-frosted window, Lucy Spencer sat cradling a porcelain cup of fragrant tea, her gaze lost in the swirling fog that softened Dunford's familiar outlines. Only recently returned from Morocco, Lucy carried with her an unmistakable air of the world beyond, not ostentatious, but evident in the way she held herself, in the faint exotic scent clinging to her embroidered shawl. The delicate chime of silver bracelets on her wrist was an echo of distant lands, of stories yet untold. "Nothing compares to Dunford's crisp mornings," she murmured, a wistful smile teasing her lips. "But I confess, I do miss the spice markets, the scent of orange blossoms in the air. The world beyond is beautiful, and treacherous." Brooks regarded her with curiosity, his eyes flickering toward the richly woven shawl. "Moroccan, is it? A souvenir?" Lucy nodded, running her fingers lightly over the intricate stitching. "A gift," she admitted, "from a Berber woman who guided me through the Atlas Mountains. She told me that every stitch in this cloth carries a blessing for safe travels." Agatha studied Lucy over the rim of her teacup, the flickering firelight catching in her piercing grey eyes. In a village as insular as Dunford, an adventurous soul was bound to provoke whispers. Yet Lucy, for all her worldliness, was an open book in some ways, difficult to distrust. Even so, Agatha had spent a lifetime recognizing when someone harbored secrets. And Lucy, curious, fearless, independent, was exactly the kind of person whose secrets could be the most dangerous of all. Outside, the village lay cloaked in pastoral charm, but here, within the warm-lit confines of the old Lantern Inn, that charm felt like a thin veil over something darker, sharper. The stolen recipe book, dismissed at first as mere petty rivalry, had begun to cast a much longer shadow. The crude warning, "I'll make sure you don't win," hinted at something more than simple sabotage. Someone had gone to great lengths to orchestrate this theft, and now Agatha wondered, was it truly about a competition, or was it merely a cover for something deeper, something far more insidious? She placed her cup down with a soft clink, and gestured for the others to lean in. "Consider this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Who benefits most from Margaret Carter's misfortune?" The upcoming bake-off was not just about prestige, it came with financial rewards, philanthropic donations, and the kind of reputation that could elevate someone from obscurity to recognition. Was the culprit a jealous competitor, or was there a more intricate motive at play? Lucy frowned, her fingers tightening around her teacup as she glanced out the window where the fog hung thick and unyielding. "Surely you don't think an outsider would come all this way just to sabotage her? That seems extreme." Brooks tapped a thoughtful finger against his chin. "Perhaps, but we can't discount the possibility of someone being hired for such a task, or an old grudge resurfacing at just the right time. People take these competitions more seriously than they should." His smile was wry, but his gaze was sharp. "Some would do anything to win, especially if they've lost before." A silence settled over the room, thick as the mist outside. Agatha let it stretch, knowing that sometimes the weight of silence could draw out the most involuntary confessions. Finally she exhaled, her fingers trailing over the rim of her saucer. "There is another angle," she murmured. "The charity set to receive the prize money. What if the target isn't Margaret Carter at all? What if the real objective is to divert that money elsewhere?" At this, Brooks's genial expression darkened slightly. He was known to champion a struggling clinic in the neighboring town, one constantly in need of donations. Agatha saw the flicker of realization in his eyes, a new thread in the tangled mystery. Beyond the inn's walls the fog thickened, pressing against the leaded windows as if trying to listen. The church bell tolled the hour, a deep, resonant sound that carried through the damp air like a warning. Somewhere in Dunford, someone had already decided their next move, and Agatha Marple intended to be ahead of them when they did. A hush had settled over Dunford, the kind that arrived not with peace, but with the weight of unspoken suspicions. Agatha Marple noted the way Dr. Brooks's geniality wavered, just for a second as he mulled over the possibility. If Margaret Carter intended to donate her winnings to a rival institution, might that have stirred resentment? A small shift in Brooks's expression was enough to tell her he had considered it. Across from him, Lucy Spencer exhaled softly, her delicate fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "I only hope," she murmured, "that the culprit isn't someone we trust." The weight of her words settled like a second fog in the parlor, unseen but stifling. Outside, the mist had begun to break apart beneath the hesitant fingers of a pale morning sun, revealing the outlines of tall poplar trees swaying along the cobbled main street. But inside, the air remained thick with something far heavier than autumn chill. And then, as if the very walls of the old Lantern Inn had ears, the wooden beams above them gave a faint, restless creak. The three companions rose from their seats, exchanging a glance of silent resolve. This was no longer just a puzzle of misplaced recipes. This was a matter of pride, trust, and perhaps something much darker lurking beneath the village's familiar surface. From below, the muted sounds of Margaret's employees setting tables for the midday crowd drifted through the floorboards, but even the clatter of cutlery could not shake the feeling that they were now moving through a game with stakes far greater than anyone had imagined. Dr. Brooks straightened his coat, his voice carefully measured. A conversation with Margaret may prove insightful. In the shock of last night, she might have overlooked something small but crucial. His usual warmth was there, but now sharpened by intent. Lucy reached for her intricately embroidered shawl, draping it around her shoulders like an unspoken shield. "I'll speak with the shopkeepers. It's a long shot, but they may have noticed unfamiliar faces lurking about." There was a steeliness beneath her usual charm, as though the very notion of betrayal had awakened some deeper resolve. Agatha allowed herself the faintest of smiles, a glint of dry wit sparking in her grey eyes. "Excellent thinking, Lucy, and do remember trivial details often prove to be the most revealing." Her voice was light, but there was no mistaking the weight behind her words. "After all," she added softly, "sometimes the greatest secrets are hidden behind the most ordinary facades." And so they stepped out into the hush of the village morning, Agatha with her calm deliberation, Brooks with his physician's intuition, and Lucy with her worldly insight. None of them could yet grasp just how deep the web of motivations stretched beneath Dunford's placid veneer, nor how heavily the spectre of sabotage and secrecy would weigh upon them all. But they pressed forward, bound not only by curiosity, but by something stronger, a quiet, unspoken oath to uncover the truth. Behind them, the old Lantern Inn seemed to shift in the morning light, its ancient timbers sighing, as if the very building itself understood the gravity of what was unfolding within its walls. In the courtyard, the golden sun cast long creeping shadows across the stone pavement, the warm glow doing little to dispel the chill in the air. And within the inn's snug parlor, two figures remained, one Margaret Carter, mistress of this once honored establishment, the other Martin Lowe, the quiet newcomer who had stirred more than just curiosity. They were at the heart of this gathering storm, whether they realized it yet or not. And somewhere in Dunford, the real culprit was already planning their next move. The rhythmic pulse of Dunford's daily life had faltered, its comfortable routine unsettled by an act so deliberate, so unnerving, that it left behind more than mere uncertainty, it left suspicion. At the heart of this disquiet stood Margaret Cavendish, the stalwart mistress of the Widow's Hearth Inn, a place as rich in history as the village itself. Neither young nor old, Margaret carried an air of unshaken determination, though the delicate etchings of worry now lined her face, deepening the soft creases around her perceptive brown eyes. Her once vivid auburn hair, now streaked with silver, was tucked into a practiced twist, a style that spoke of both efficiency and restraint. Clad in a simple yet impeccably tailored day dress, she moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime tending to others. And yet beneath that polished surface, a storm brewed. Theft. Sabotage. Betrayal. Margaret had spent the night in a restless haze, torn between outrage and disbelief. Who would do this? And more importantly, why? Even now, standing at the polished mahogany sideboard, methodically arranging cups and saucers for the morning's first guests, she felt the weight of it. The inn had endured its fair share of whispers and long-forgotten scandals, but this was something far more insidious. A creak in the old beams above made her glance toward the tall windows. The heavy damask curtains, drawn to block out the dreary morning chill, held back the weak, hesitant light that struggled to break through. Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening around the delicate porcelain cup in her grasp. "Perhaps I should leave them open wider," she murmured, half to herself, half to the figure standing near the door. "I'd hate for my inn to feel as gloomy as I do." Martin Gray, the man who had, for reasons unknown, arrived in Dunford only months before, and had since occupied a peculiar space between respect and quiet unease. A man of measured movements and guarded words, his close-cropped dark hair peppered with silver at the temples, and his tailored but unassuming tweed coat spoke of someone accustomed to blending in, yet never quite becoming part of the background. Some whispered that he had served in intelligence during the war, though no one could confirm the details. He sidestepped curiosity as deftly as a practiced chess player, avoiding an obvious trap. "Gloom doesn't suit you, Mrs. Cavendish," he said at last, stepping forward into the narrow column of sunlight that filtered through the room. Dust motes swirled around him, as if disturbed by something unseen. His voice was even, yet beneath its polished civility, there was something else. An awareness. Margaret exhaled sharply. "It isn't the break-in that troubles me most." She placed the cup down, more forcefully than intended. "It's what I stand to lose." Martin studied her, dark eyes betraying the faintest flicker of understanding. "I imagine the sum must be significant." "Substantial enough," she admitted, smoothing her palms against her skirt as if brushing away an invisible weight. "But it's not just money. The donation was promised to a cause that means everything to me." A silence stretched between them, thick and unmoving, interrupted only by the faint hum of voices beyond the parlor walls. The inn's staff bustled about, their presence distant, their footsteps softened by the thick Persian runner that lined the hall. But here, within the confines of the parlor, the hush was different. It was the kind of silence that settled when unspoken truths pressed too close, when secrets threatened to break the surface. And then, as if summoned by the weight of the moment, Agatha Forsyth appeared. She did not enter so much as arrive, her presence as seamless as a shadow lengthening at dusk. She moved with the quiet assurance of someone who never had to demand attention to command it, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her sharp gaze assessing without judgment. There was something about her, a presence both familiar and unsettling, like a candle burning in the dark, steady and unyielding. Margaret turned toward her with an exhale of something between relief and caution. The game had already begun, and Agatha Forsyth did not play games unless she intended to win. Margaret forced a steadying breath, masking her unease with a practiced grace as she smoothed an invisible crease on her apron. "I was just, feeling terribly out of sorts," she admitted, her voice carrying a slight tremor beneath its usual composure. "Have you discovered anything yet?" The question was directed at Agatha Forsyth, whose mere presence in the parlor felt like a soft but deliberate pressure against the room's already fragile atmosphere. Agatha tilted her head, offering a knowing, almost indulgent smile. "One hardly uncovers a culprit overnight, my dear. But fresh perspectives and gentle questions often illuminate the darkest corners." Her voice was calm, measured, yet something in her tone suggested she had already begun uncovering the first loose threads. From his position near the fireplace, Martin Gray watched in quiet amusement, arms folded across his chest. He had seen interrogations unfold in many settings, some less civilized than this, but there was an art to Agatha's method. She asked without asking, listened without pressing, and yet she always walked away with more than she had been given. He studied her in silence until finally speaking, his voice even and unhurried. "They say you have quite a knack for these affairs, Miss Forsyth." A small pause. Any immediate suspicions? Agatha turned her gaze toward him, her expression kind yet unrelenting. "I prefer not to deal in suspicions, Mr. Gray. Facts, however, have a remarkable way of revealing themselves when one exercises patience." A flicker of something passed across Martin's face, approval perhaps, or the ghost of an old habit long forgotten. He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words without offering anything further. Margaret, meanwhile, placed the final cup onto the tray with a decisive click. "Well, if you ask me, it's one of my rivals from the bake-off." Her tone had regained its usual fortitude, though a hint of unease still clung to her words. "Anne Hathaway, perhaps. She's been complaining for years that my recipes give me an unfair advantage. Or that pastry chef from the north. He looked rather envious of my dishes last year." She hesitated, a shadow crossing her expression. But then again, what if it wasn't an outsider? Her voice dropped slightly, as if speaking the thought aloud solidified the fear she had been trying to ignore. What if it was someone from Dunford? Someone I trust? Martin's gaze flickered toward the sash window, his expression unreadable. Something in his stance changed, a slight shift of his weight, a brief hesitation, as if recalling a memory he wasn't sure he should revisit. Agatha caught the movement in her peripheral vision, filing it away without comment. "There could be a dozen plausible motives," she said at last, smoothing a hand over her skirt. "Jealousy, spite, desperation. But we must be careful. Misdirection is a powerful tool." Margaret let out a breath, her fingers curling against the hem of her apron. "I just want my recipes back," she admitted. "Or at least a chance to recreate them before the festival. Whoever did this, they weren't just being petty, they were being cruel." Martin's voice was lower now, the usual sharpness softened. "We'll help you, Mrs. Cavendish." His words were simple but steady. The widow's hearth has been part of this community for too long to stand alone now. Agatha caught the distinction immediately. This community, not our community, not my community. He was still an outsider, despite how effortlessly he had slipped into Dunford's daily rhythms. But she did not comment. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough before steering the conversation toward the details of Margaret's routine on the night of the theft. It was in these small mundane recollections, gestures, forgotten moments, the way people spoke of their daily rituals, that the truth often surfaced. Margaret recounted the evening carefully, preparing the dough in the afternoon, greeting the travelers who checked into the inn, locking the storeroom before retiring for the night. Martin listened with the careful attentiveness of a man trained to hear what wasn't being said. Agatha's questions were gentle but deliberate. Any unusual deliveries, any unfamiliar faces, any detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. Then Margaret hesitated. There was something strange. The air in the parlor seemed to still. The storeroom door, it was slightly open. Agatha's expression remained composed, but Martin stiffened almost imperceptibly. "You're certain you secured it?" Agatha's voice was mild, but there was a weight behind it. "Absolutely," Margaret said. "I never leave that door unlocked." But after the theft, it was ajar. A pause, the kind that carries more weight than words. Martin's gaze flicked toward the corridor where the storeroom lay beyond, a detail worth noting. Agatha's lips curved ever so slightly. "As I said," she murmured, "facts have a way of revealing themselves." Somewhere beyond the parlor, the sound of footsteps in the hall signaled the arrival of the maid, preparing for the midday luncheon. Soon the widow's hearth's dining room, with its stained glass windows, its heavy oak paneling, its sense of old-world charm, would fill with chattering guests. Blissfully unaware, of course, that something far darker now lurked beneath the surface of their peaceful little village. Mysteries were unfolding right under their noses, yet the unease in the parlor remained thick, woven into the air like the scent of aged wood and spiced tea. Below, the muffled clang of pots and low murmurs from the kitchen underscored the fragile tension hanging between them. Margaret squared her shoulders, fighting against the creeping weight of uncertainty. "I'll manage," she declared, mustering a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "I don't have the luxury of dwelling on this. The bake-off is days away, and if I'm to stand a chance, I must adjust." A wry, almost defiant determination flickered in her eyes, a woman too stubborn to succumb to misfortune. Agatha Forsyth inclined her head, a knowing smile gracing her lips. "And we will do our part to see you through, dear. Rest assured." Martin Gray, standing near the mantelpiece, offered a single decisive nod. "Count on it, Mrs. Cavendish." His words were simple, but there was a quiet force behind them. As Margaret excused herself, vanishing through the heavy wooden doors to attend to her staff, a hush settled over the room. Agatha and Martin lingered, their figures reflected in the large gilt-framed mirror above the fireplace, two watchful figures, both accustomed to observing the unspoken. Beyond the window, the early sun spilled tentative light into the courtyard, turning damp cobblestones to amber. A distant rooster, late to its duty, let out a cry that was swallowed by the silence of the inn. Agatha broke the stillness first. "You're quite determined to help Margaret, Mr. Gray." She spoke lightly, but there was precision in her words. "I find that admirable." Martin met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unreadable. "Everyone deserves a fair chance, Miss Forsyth." He paused, his next words deliberate. "Especially in a village so fond of tradition." Agatha's lips curved into a small, enigmatic smile, the kind that suggested understanding, though she revealed nothing of her thoughts. Indeed, and so the stage was set. Two keen-eyed watchers, drawn into the intricate web of ambition, betrayal, and veiled resentments that stretched across Dunhaven. The Widow's Hearth Inn, once a haven of warmth and hospitality, had transformed overnight into a crucible for unearthing the town's darkest impulses. The spreading daylight did little to chase away the lingering unease, and as the parlor shadows receded, the questions remained. Who had dared sabotage Margaret Cavendish? And why take such a risk, knowing the repercussions? But perhaps, more chillingly, what else lay beneath the surface, hidden within the cracks of this quiet village? Outside, Dunhaven was bathed in a languid haze of midday sun, softening its sharp rooftops into gentle silhouettes. But in the heart of the widow's hearth, within its snug sitting room, the unease had only deepened. Agatha Forsyth took her customary seat, the glow of the fireplace catching the silver strands of her neatly pinned hair. Across from her, Lucy Spencer reclined in a worn velvet armchair, fingers absently tracing the cover of a small leather-bound notebook. A faint flush colored her cheeks, a telltale sign of someone holding on to words too heavy to keep inside for long. The air shifted as Dawson Brooks entered, his usual boisterous energy, a stark contrast to the hushed tension in the room. "Hope no one minds if I steal a cup," he mused, eyeing the teapot as he helped himself. Settling beside Agatha, he cast an easy grin, though the sharp glint in his eyes suggested he, too, had sensed the unease stirring through the village. They were waiting on Martin Gray, who had taken it upon himself to check the livery for any unusual activity. Ever discreet, he had made no promises, only offering that cool, measured nod of his before vanishing down the inn's corridor. Yet despite the small talk, despite Dawson's attempt to fill the space with idle chatter, conversation inevitably curved back toward Margaret Cavendish, the woman whose stolen recipes had sparked more than just whispers. Lucy's hazel eyes flickered with something unreadable, a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and perhaps something else. And as the wind pressed against the window panes, rattling them ever so slightly, Agatha had the unshakable sense that this was only the beginning. Margaret Cavendish's string of victories at the Dunhaven bake-off was nothing short of remarkable. 3 wins in a row, for a modest village competition, That was nearly unheard of. Dr. Dawson Reeves let out a low chuckle, the kind that carried both amusement and the faintest edge of something else. She's talented, no doubt, he mused, swirling his tea lazily in its porcelain cup. And she knows how to work a crowd, particularly the judges. That hasn't exactly made her popular with the other contestants, mind you. Some have lost to her more than once. Agatha Forsyth, ever composed, stirred her tea with a delicate motion. If envy or wounded pride are at play, she observed mildly, then sabotage might have been the simplest way to bring her down a peg. Greed and jealousy often wear the most unassuming masks. Before Lucy Spencer could respond, the door to the sitting room creaked open, and Martin Gray stepped in, his movements precise and deliberate. A crisp draught of autumn air slipped through with him, carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. His dark eyes flicked across the room, assessing, calculating. He nodded politely, but Agatha, ever perceptive, noted the flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. "You were speaking of Margaret's rivals, I presume." His voice was even, though there was a subtle weight behind the words. He removed his coat, hanging it neatly on the hat stand before crossing to the hearth. "Indeed," Dawson said, watching him with quiet curiosity. Martin's lips pressed together for a fraction of a second before he continued. "Anne Holloway has made no secret of her frustrations. She claims Margaret's pies always seem to coincidentally match the judges' preferences." A pause, just long enough to let the accusation settle. "And then there's that traveling pastry chef, Mr. Tyle, who once dismissed Margaret's victories as nothing more than hometown favoritism, masquerading as skill." Lucy's hazel eyes gleamed with intrigue. "Which makes either of them potential suspects, wouldn't you say?" Dawson lifted one shoulder in an idle shrug. "The question is whether resentment alone is enough to drive someone to theft and sabotage." He took a measured sip of his tea, his voice turning thoughtful. "And let's not forget, whoever wins this year controls where the charitable donation goes. If someone wanted to ensure the money didn't end up in Margaret's hands, they might be willing to go to unsavory lengths." A silence settled over the room, punctuated only by the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the low whisper of wind against the window panes. Then, with a suddenness that made even Agatha lift an eyebrow, Lucy cleared her throat, clutching her notebook a fraction tighter. She hesitated, weighing something unspoken. "Well, this might sound unusual, but during my last trip abroad, I stumbled across something personal. Something about someone here in Dunhaven." Her fingers drummed once, twice, against the book's worn leather cover before she inhaled softly. "I can't say who." "Not yet, but it made me realize, not everyone is who they claim to be." A fractional shift, a nearly imperceptible stiffening. Agatha caught it, the way Martin's posture tightened for the briefest moment before he masked it with an easy roll of his sleeve cuff. A trained observer would have missed it. Agatha was not a mere observer. Dawson, ever the inquisitive sort, leaned in, his expression one of barely veiled curiosity. "Dare we ask for a hint, Lucy, or must we all sit in suspense?" Lucy's lips curled in a coy smile. "Let's just say I came across a name in a rather unexpected place. I'm not sure yet if it's relevant to the theft of Margaret's recipe book, but..." She let the sentence hang, unfinished. Tantalizing. Martin looked as though he might speak. He didn't. Instead, his fingers tightened briefly against his sleeve, his expression unreadable. The air in the snug sitting room felt suddenly thick, the carved paneling and heavy drapes lending an almost suffocating closeness to the moment. There was something unspoken in the air, a bristle of tension, a quiet clash of hidden truths. Agatha, ever one to steer conversation with the lightest of hands, finally broke the silence. With a mild humor that masked something far sharper, she murmured, "Lucy, my dear, you do have a flair for dramatic timing. One only hopes that this discovery of yours doesn't resurface at the most inopportune moment." Lucy's cheeks darkened slightly, though her expression remained composed. Martin, saying nothing, simply adjusted his cufflink again. Another moment of silence, stretched, taut, expectant, as though the very walls of the inn had drawn closer to listen. Outside, the wind sighed against the window panes. The faintest rustle, like something unseen shifting just beyond reach. And then, with a genial chuckle that did nothing to break the tension, Dawson finally spoke. "Enough cloak and dagger for the morning, I say. How about something practical? I'll see if any of my patients have noticed odd behavior among the villagers, or any traveling salesmen, for that matter. People do tend to confide in their doctors." His words trailed off though, as the wind pressed harder against the glass, rattling it softly, and still, no one moved. Dr. Martin recovered swiftly, his expression smoothing into practiced composure as he adjusted his cuff. "I can make discreet inquiries as well," he offered, his tone carefully neutral. "This may be nothing more than a resentful competitor, but if Lucy's discovery connects back to our saboteur, well," he paused, letting the weight of the implication settle, "then the bake-off may not be the only motive in play." Agatha Forsyth leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly cradling the handle of her teacup, the fine porcelain catching a glint of afternoon sun, a gleam that seemed almost mocking. "Yes, indeed," she murmured, her expression thoughtful, unreadable. "Dunhaven seems brimming with motives, rivalries, concealed pasts, ambitions that stretch far beyond a mere competition. One does wonder," she mused, tilting her head slightly, "how many of these tangled threads must converge before we see the full tapestry of truth." Outside, the wind sighed through the narrow streets, a restless whisper against moss-covered stone and golden autumn leaves. Yet, it was not the winds of the season that carried the true storm, it was the quiet, calculating minds within this village, their hearts burdened with pride, fear and longing. And as Lucy's revelation hung in the charged silence, Agatha could not shake the feeling that this mystery delved far deeper than a stolen recipe book. A languid September sun cast its golden glow over the winding lanes of Dunhaven, turning the ancient stained glass windows of the village church into shimmering pools of color. Market stalls bustled, voices rising in friendly chatter, yet an undercurrent of unease threaded through the crowd. Margaret Cavendish's missing recipe book was no longer just a trivial gossip piece, it had become something much darker, whispered in corners, exchanged in cautious glances over cups of tea. Behind the thick wooden doors of the Black Lantern Inn, Agatha stepped into the private lounge, her sharp gaze sweeping over the dimly lit room. By the mullioned window, standing amidst the golden motes of dust, dancing in the late afternoon light, Dr. Edwin Reeves held a posture of quiet tension. The ever-amiable physician, known for his unwavering composure, now bore the faintest trace of unease, his hands clasped firmly behind his back, his jaw set in rigid thought. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, offering a cordial nod. "Miss Forsyth," he greeted, though his voice carried the slightest edge of preoccupation. "You've heard, I presume. Mrs. Burton of Maple Street claims she saw a stranger lurking about last night," he exhaled, shaking his head. "Though unfortunately, she only confided in me." I attempted to press for details, but her recollection was lacking. Agatha lifted an eyebrow, a wry smile playing at her lips. "Vagueness, Doctor, has a way of concealing surprising truths," she remarked lightly. Then, after a brief pause, she inclined her head. "But what I truly find interesting is how very agitated you seem." Dr. Reeves shifted his weight slightly, his fingers tightening behind his back before he exhaled, his gaze drifting past her to the village square beyond the window. "It's the bake-off," he admitted, the words carefully chosen. "I have a personal stake of sorts. The charitable donation from the event's winner, should Margaret be unable to compete, would be directed toward my clinic." Agatha's steel-grey eyes softened with quiet understanding. She knew well enough that Dr. Reeves treated many of Dunhaven's poor at little to no charge. His concern was not merely financial, it was a necessity. And yet she also knew that even the noblest of intentions could, at times, blur uncomfortably close to ambition. If one's cause stood to benefit from an unexpected upset, well, morality could be a flexible thing, in the right hands. Before she could respond, the door to the lounge swung open, the brisk footfalls of Lucy Spencer breaking the moment's tension. She stepped inside with that same effortless confidence she carried since returning from her travels, her presence commanding in a way that suggested she had spent time in far grander circles than a village tea-room. Yet, as her gaze landed on Dr. Reeves, on the faintly unsettled air about him, she hesitated, her sharp intuition catching on the shift in atmosphere. "Doctor, Miss Forsyth," she greeted smoothly, though there was a flicker of assessment in her hazel eyes. Then, noticing the tightness in Reeves' expression, she paused. "Am I interrupting?" Dr. Reeves' geniality returned with the well-practiced ease of a man accustomed to setting people at ease. "Not at all, my dear Lucy," he said, offering a polite smile. "We were merely discussing the bake-off." Lucy lowered herself onto a chaise, unfastening the leather satchel at her side and placing it beside her. She regarded him steadily. "Yes, the stakes do seem unusually high this year, don't they?" For a brief second, the room was still. Only the distant sounds of village life filled the silence, the soft murmur of conversation beyond the lounge, the faint creak of floorboards settling, the whisper of wind curling through the inn's eaves. And yet, beneath the pleasantries, beneath the idle musings of a mere baking contest, Agatha could feel it, a tension coiling just beneath the surface. A stranger lurking in the dark, a man with too much to lose, a secret that once uncovered, might change the stakes entirely. This was no longer just about stolen recipes. This was about the quiet shadows that clung to Dunhaven's most respectable names. And the question now was not whether the truth would come to light. It was whether everyone in this room was ready for it. Margaret's entry had been sabotaged. Of that, there was no doubt. Yet, as Lucy let the words hang in the thick hush of the lounge, she couldn't help but feel that this was merely the surface of something far deeper, something roiling beneath the polite smiles and well-pressed linens of Dunhaven's villagers. The heavy tapestries lining the walls seemed to lean inward, their faded patterns whispering of long-forgotten hunts and secret gatherings. The old Wyvern Inn had once been a nobleman's retreat, a place where men boasted over brandy and schemes were woven in dim candlelight. Tonight, it felt like those old ghosts still prowled, unseen but ever watchful. Agatha Forsyth, ever composed, rested her chin on her gloved hand, her expression unreadable. The trouble with large sums of money, she mused, is that they do tend to cloud one's better judgment. Ambition, I find, has a way of poisoning even the most neighborly of spirits. Her eyes, sharp as flint, flickered toward Dr. Reeves, whose fingers had curled just slightly behind his back, an instinctive clench, fleeting but telling. He exhaled softly, his breath barely stirring the charged air between them. "I won't pretend the donation means nothing to me. If Margaret loses, my clinic stands to receive the winnings." His voice, usually smooth and genial, held an edge of something tighter. "But sabotage, theft, I would never." He stopped, jaw tightening, as though the very accusation offended him. For just a flicker of a moment, something cold passed through his gaze, a hardness, then it was gone, retreating beneath his usual warmth. "All I hope for is that the rightful winner earns their place fairly." Lucy, ever watchful, tilted her head. "And yet, Doctor, you yourself pointed out how trifles, small things can become momentous in a village like this, especially when resources are scarce, and reputations hang by a thread." Agatha let the silence stretch, let the weight of Lucy's words settle in the dim-lit lounge. Then, with a quiet nod, she murmured, "Indeed. In my experience, the difference between a harmless quarrel and something much darker is often alarmingly thin." A gust of laughter spilled through the thick wooden doors, the sound distant yet jarring in the hush of the room. Beyond the inn, the village moved as it always did, farmers hauling crates, children darting between stalls, merchants weaving ribbons through their fingers as they called out their wares. But here, in the quiet gloom of the lounge, the air felt close, pressed in. The walls themselves seemed to know that something simmered just beneath the surface of Dunhaven's quaint charm. At length, Lucy shifted, her gaze sliding sidelong toward Dr. Reeves. "You mentioned something earlier, a rumor, about a stranger in town." He hesitated, rubbing his palm against his wrist before answering. "Mrs. Burton claims she saw a man skulking near the inn's back entrance last night." His tone was skeptical, but his mouth thinned slightly. "Truthfully, she's prone to exaggeration, but she swears he was dressed in dark clothing, watching the building before slipping away." A small forced chuckle escaped him. "It's likely nothing." Agatha's gaze swept the dimly lit room, taking in the interplay of tension, ambition, and fear written across Dr. Reeves' composed face. She had spent a lifetime reading people, deciphering what was said, and more importantly, what was not. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long fingers of gold over the village rooftops. The gentle hum of village life continued uninterrupted, but within these walls, the shadows stretched deeper. The bake-off, once a simple contest, had become something else entirely. A quiet battle of ambition and desperation, and as the stakes rose, so did the lengths to which some might go to ensure victory. The three of them stepped into the corridor, exchanging polite smiles, polite words. But as Agatha walked away, her thoughts remained uneasy. She had seen it before, how easily goodwill could sour, how swiftly desperation could sharpen into something dangerous. And if she was right, then Dunhaven's charming little bake-off was on the verge of boiling over into something far, far worse.